She was sold by her father to pay a gambling debt. The cowboy didn't even want a wife. The girl hadn't known the sound of boots behind her until they stopped, not in hesitation, not in mercy, just the hard halt of a deal done. And as she turned with a face covered in dust and disbelief, her father's shadow vanished down the trail like a man who never had a daughter to begin with. Her body ached from the wagon ride. Her wrists still bore the raw burn of being tied too tightly for too long. And though she didn't cry, not even when the men at the saloon laughed and passed silver between their fingers like she was a slab of beef on the butcher's block, her chest swelled with something worse than tears. It was the kind of emptiness that ate the edges of a soul. The cowboy didn't look at her the way men did in towns. There was no hunger, no pity, just the kind of cold exhaustion that settled in men who had lost things they never spoke of. His boots scuffed the boards as he handed over a sack of coins. The barkeep counted slow, his yellow teeth grinning all the while, and the cowboy took her arm, not like he owned her, but like he didn't want the trouble at all. He didn't speak, not a single word, but his silence said everything. She was nothing to him, just another problem with two legs and no use. Still, when the old wagon creaked forward and the town faded behind them like a fever dream, she watched him instead of the road. He had eyes that seemed to have seen too many graves, and a mouth that had forgotten how to shape kindness. He didn't ask her name, didn't offer his, and maybe that was a mercy, because whatever name she once carried had been spat on, traded, and left behind on a gambling table. She knew better than to cry, better than to hope, but when the wind cooled and the land opened wide and empty like the chest of a dead man, she closed her eyes and told herself that silence wasn't cruelty. It was just what the world gave back to those who had already screamed. The land was all broken hills and brittle grass, the kind that bent under hoof but never gave way, and she rode behind him like a shadow that didn't belong to the light. The sun cracked her skin, the wind dried her lips, and the ache in her belly gnawed like hunger mixed with shame. And yet something about the steadiness of his back, the way his shoulders never slumped no matter how steep the climb, made her believe he wasn't the kind to raise a hand unless it was to build or bury. The cabin wasn't much. Just timber slapped together, roof patched with hides and hope, but it stood tall against the wind and welcomed no one, not even her. He opened the door and stepped aside, not to invite, just to make space, and she walked in without knowing what was expected. Her hands clenched so tight her knuckles whitened with the memory of being held down. The inside was sparse, a single cot, a stove, a trunk with rusted hinges. And as she lowered herself to the corner like a dog who knew better than to sit on a man's rug, she listened to the sound of his boots as they moved without hurry, without fear, just like everything else about him. There were no questions, no orders, only the cold scrape of tin against iron as he boiled water and set bread on a plate, placing it beside her without looking down. She didn't thank him, didn't know how to thank a man who didn't ask to own her, and she ate like someone who didn't deserve to eat. That night, when the dark came thick and without stars, she lay on the cold floor while he sat by the stove with his eyes closed but his jaw tight. And somewhere between the silence and the creaking timber, something passed between them that wasn't kindness, wasn't understanding, just the quiet acceptance of two people too broken to ask why. Outside, coyotes called to each other in voices full of loneliness and fire, and inside, the girl curled herself tight and waited for the world to decide what kind of pain would come next, but it didn't, not yet. And as the wind pushed against the door and the fire hissed low, the girl stayed awake just long enough to wonder if maybe, just maybe, the man who didn't want a wife wasn't cruel after all. Maybe he was just tired of burying things he didn't mean to keep. The morning didn't rise gently. It bled across the plains like a wound, seeping into the cracks of the earth and the quiet corners of the cabin where shadows still clung to the floor. And as the girl stirred from the hardboards where she had curled her aching body, she felt the stiffness in her bones like a punishment carved by sleep itself. Her palms were scraped raw, her throat dry, and her stomach clenched like it was folding in on itself. But she made no sound, not even when the cowboy moved past her with his coat already on, his rifle slung across his back, and the smell of leather and cold steel trailing behind him like memory. He left without words, just as he'd done everything else, as if the house was still his alone, and she were nothing more than a ghost, squatting in a place meant for the living. And for a moment she simply sat there, hunched in the corner, watching the empty doorway like it might speak to her more honestly than any man ever had. When she rose, her legs trembled from the bruises that ran beneath her skin, marks left not by him, but by the men who had dragged her into that saloon, by the weight of her father's hand as he'd shoved her forward, by the carriage ride that jostled. More than just bones. And yet she did not cry, not even when the frost outside clung to the glass like a whisper of death. She found water by the basin, cold as regret, and splashed her face without looking at her reflection. She no longer recognized the girl who stared back at her anyway. The bread he'd left was hard, but she ate it slow, every bite a prayer she didn't know how to finish. And when the door finally creaked open again and his boots stepped back inside, she looked up, not with fear, not with hope, but with the hollow stillness of someone who had stopped expecting anything at all. He brought no game, no bags, no change, just mud on his boots and silence in his eyes. And as he set the rifle down against the wall and sat on the cot without removing his coat, she realized he was the kind of man who didn't change anything he didn't have to, not even himself. There was distance between them still, not the kind that could be measured in feet, but the kind that lived between breaths and glances. And when she turned her face away from him and reached for the stove to stoke the embers, she did it not to please him, but because she couldn't bear the thought of sitting still. The silence grew, not loud, not heavy, just there, like a coat neither of them could take off, stitched with things they didn't know how to name. The days did not announce themselves. They unfolded like forgotten songs, one quiet chord at a time. And though neither of them spoke, the girl began to learn the rhythm of the man's life, the way he rose with a purpose he never voiced and returned with the weight of miles in his shoulders. And with every passing hour, she grew more certain that whatever had brought her here was a mistake, yet somehow a softer one than the place she'd come from. She began to sweep the floor without being asked, to wash the tin bowls and stack them neatly, to patch the torn blanket that lay across the cot, as if it were a task that meant something. And even though he never said a word, she noticed how his eyes lingered for a heartbeat longer on the mended seams, how he paused when he saw a fire already lit. He didn't praise her, didn't thank her, but he didn't stop her either, and that was enough. She learned he walked the far ridge behind the house with a rifle in hand, and she sometimes watched from the window, imagining the world beyond. She wondered what had made a man like him buy a girl he didn't want, whether it was guilt or debt or something neither of them understood. And though he barely looked her way, he never struck her, never touched her, never called her by a name she'd hate. There was a kindness in that, a bitter, cracked kind, but it was more than she'd known before. She slept on the floor still, not because he told her to, but because she didn't dare cross the line between tolerated and unwanted. And every time she closed her eyes, she listened to the sounds of the night, waiting for the sharp breath or the shifting weight that might mean pain, but it never came. One evening, as the sky burned orange and the land shimmered beneath a veil of dust, he brought back a sack of potatoes and set them on the table without a word. She peeled and cooked them slowly, her fingers aching with each cut. And when she placed the bowl before him, he nodded once, just once, but it landed inside her like a warm coal against winter's skin. That night she sat a little closer to the stove, her legs tucked beneath her, the hem of her dress brushing the wooden planks he'd hammered down himself. And as the firelight danced across the walls, she closed her eyes and let her breath even out, not in peace, but in the strange safety of silence shared. In the darkness, she didn't hear the coyotes this time, only the soft whistle of wind against the shutters and the slow, even rhythm of the cowboy's breathing. Not deep, not relaxed, but steady, like a man who knew the weight of loneliness and had simply chosen to carry it instead of setting it down. She swept before the sun touched the window panes, not because anyone asked her to, but because her hands remembered work better than stillness. The way she bent down and gathered the dust was careful and quiet, as if her body feared waking memories still crouched in corners. And when she stacked the wood neatly beside the stove, her palms stung with old blisters reopened, but she bore it like she bore everything, with clenched teeth and a head held too high for someone who'd once been sold like cattle. The cowboy passed through her silence like it didn't choke the room. He came and went with that same steady rhythm, and when he dropped rabbit on the table or set a sack of flour beside the door, he never looked to her for gratitude. but she gave it in her movement, in the way she prepared the stew just right, salted it with care, stirred without wasting a drop. She noticed he patched his boots with rough stitching, not precise but strong. And when she found a roll of leather in the trunk beneath the cot, she took it out and shaped a new sole, her needle trembling with the weight of doing something kind without being asked. He wore them the next day without a word, just laced them tight, stomped once, and rode out into the brush with that same rifle slung like a promise across his back. And though he didn't speak, she felt a thread pull between them, not thick, not warm, but real. She started walking further from the cabin now, her bare feet brushing against the dry grass, the kind that cut like paper but still bent with the wind. She followed the edge of the ridge where the sky broke wide and unpromised, and she picked wild onions and found a small patch of chamomile that she crushed between her fingers for its sharp, sweet scent. She never strayed far, never gave him reason to think she might run, not because she feared his anger, but because some part of her wanted to stay, even if it was in silence, even if the walls still held no place for her name. She began to recognize the creak of his saddle, the clink of his belt buckle, the breath he took before entering the cabin. And though he never said it, she knew he had started to expect her presence, the same way a man expects dawn after too many nights of choking dark. Still no words came, no labels placed, and she held that space between them like a china cup, delicate and dangerous, always near shattering. The storm came without warning, a low, crawling groan in the earth before the clouds gathered like bruises across the sky. And when the first strike of lightning flashed across the hills, she was hanging laundry on the rope tied between two leaning posts, the sheets snapping in the wind like a flag signaling surrender. Her heart jumped, not from the storm, but from the memory of running, hiding, bracing herself against the thunder of boots and fists and doors slammed too hard. And as the rain came in thick, angry bursts, she rushed to gather what she could, her hair plastered to her neck, her breath hitching with every gust that fought to rip the clothes from her hands. He appeared through the curtain of rain like a ghost made of leather and thunder, horse-rearing, coat soaked through, eyes narrowed against the sting of water. And for a moment she froze, gripping the wet fabric like it might save her. But he only reached down, grabbed the line in one swift pull, and yanked the pins free, wrapping the sheets around one arm like a wounded flag. They got inside without a word, she dripping, he tracking mud across the floorboards she'd scrubbed just that morning, and she waited, unsure whether the storm outside was worse than whatever storm might rise in his chest. But he simply shook his coat off and tossed the bundle beside the stove, kneeling to feed the fire with a handful of kindling so gently it looked like worship. She changed behind the hanging blanket she used as a curtain, teeth chattering not from cold, but from the way something inside her had cracked when kindness appeared like that, not to harm, not to claim, just to help. And when she emerged in her dry dress and placed her soaked garments near the flames, she didn't sit far from him this time. The thunder rolled above them like the sky itself was tearing open, but inside the cabin held a strange stillness, the kind that follows not safety but understanding. She handed him a tin cup filled with the last of the strong tea, brewed bitter with roots and hope, and he took it, drank deep, set it down, not a word spoken, not even a nod, and still it filled her chest with something she didn't have the name for. That night they didn't sleep far apart, not together, not touching, just closer than before. And when she closed her eyes, listening to the storm soften into silence, she didn't dream of being sold or bound or forgotten. She dreamed of a man sitting beside her in the dark, quiet as dusk, and of a world that might yet let her live without apology. The warmth from the storm's fire clung longer than the storm itself. Days passed not through clocks or calendars, but through the settling of dust, the soft shift in the way she moved, how she no longer flinched when his boots crossed the floor or when his hands brushed past her reaching for wood. She had begun sewing again, using thread pulled from worn linens and a bent needle she'd found in the bottom of a tin box. And every stitch she pressed into the fabric felt like a word she didn't know how to say. Apologies to herself, to the girl she'd been, to the one who had screamed when her father traded her for cards and gin. She sat by the window some evenings with her knees drawn up beneath her skirt, sewing patches into the same blanket she'd once wrapped around her body like armor. And behind her, the cowboy moved without noise, his presence a constant rhythm, not demanding, not distant, just there, like wind beneath a door. The work became her way of praying, though she'd long since given up on the kind of God they'd taught her about. Instead, she whispered into the cotton, into the broken seams, and asked only for enough, not comfort, not love, just enough strength to not shatter again. Sometimes she caught him watching her, not staring, not lingering, just pausing. And when their eyes met, something would tighten in her chest, something she didn't yet understand, like standing on a cliff and tasting the wind's invitation to fall or fly. He still never spoke, and she never asked. It was a truce carved from the same stone they both seemed made of, and she honored it not out of fear, but out of a quiet respect for the scars neither had named. One morning she found a pair of his socks near the hearth, torn at the toe, and without a thought she gathered them and began darning the holes. When he saw them laid beside his boots that evening, she saw him hesitate for the first time, not in confusion, but in the kind of silent acknowledgement that lived between strangers, forced into something neither chose. It wasn't thanks, but it was something. The piece they'd built wasn't loud. It was carved in routine, in silence, in the way she knew when to step aside as he entered, how he left a tin cup for her each night, how he never touched her even when she brushed past him close enough to feel the warmth rising from his skin. And yet, beneath it all was a trembling thing, a root exposed, waiting for the weight of something cruel to fall. And when it came, it wasn't in his hands, but in the sound of hooves outside the cabin and the voice that followed, coarse and sharp and full of a man's grin. She froze, her breath catching so deep it hurt. And the cowboy's hand had already found his rifle before she even looked at him. Not panic, not fear, just readiness, like he'd known trouble would come eventually and had saved a bullet for it. The voice outside was slurred, loud, full of the stink of men who thought possession was power. And when she heard her name barked, the old name, the one she had buried in the dirt behind the cabin, something inside her broke loose and ran wild through her blood. She didn't go to the door. She sank to the floor beside the stove and pressed her hand to her mouth, her body folding in on itself like it remembered how to disappear. And the cowboy didn't speak either, didn't yell, didn't warn. There was a sound, sharp and final, the kind that made birds leap from trees and dogs stop barking, and when it passed, the voice outside was gone. She didn't ask what happened, he didn't tell her. But when he came back inside and shut the door with his jaw clenched tight enough to crack bone, she saw a streak of blood on his collar and the kind of fire in his eyes that spoke of lines crossed and debts repaid. That night, neither of them slept. She lay curled on the cot this time, not the floor, and he sat by the door with the rifle across his knees, not watching her, not guarding her, just sitting like a man who had remembered what it meant to protect something without knowing why. She didn't cry, not even then, but the tears lived just behind her eyes, a quiet flood she trained not to rise. And when she turned her face into the blanket and smelled the smoke and wool and gunpowder still clinging to the threads, she felt something break open in her. Not fear, not even safety, just a space raw and new where the past had finally loosened its grip. Outside, the wind moved through the hills like breath over old wounds, and inside she pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and let herself imagine, just once, that she was something worth fighting for. The blood was gone from the door by morning, washed clean by the same rain that turned the earth soft and left boot prints swallowed in mud. But something lingered beneath the scent of smoke and damp pine, something unseen, yet heavy, like a word left unsaid or a promise kept too late. And though neither of them spoke of the man who had come calling, his absence hung in the air like a warning carved into wind. She moved slower now, not from fear, but from weight, the kind that settled in the spine when the body finally realized it was no longer running. And each step across the floor, each time she bent to gather kindling or scrape the skillet clean, felt more rooted than before, like she had begun to belong without meaning to. The cot had become hers without being offered. No words had marked the change, no gestures, just the quiet way he no longer looked toward the floor when night fell, how he left the blanket folded there and instead leaned against the door, rifle always within reach. She slept more deeply now, though dreams still twisted like snakes in her chest, pulling her back to smoke-thick rooms and cold floors where men's hands reached and her voice had no place to land. But when she woke, there was always light, and sometimes the smell of bread or broth, and always the sound of his breathing just near enough to anchor her. One morning she found a sprig of wild sage left on the windowsill, not placed with meaning, not adorned or tied, just there. And she didn't ask, didn't even look at him, but she tucked it into the hem of her dress like it might keep her pieces together. The sewing continued, new patches for the blanket, a lining added to his coat, a small bundle of fabric folded beneath the cot where she'd begun shaping something not quite finished. She didn't know what it would be yet, only that her hands moved without her needing to tell them what to do. She cleaned the corner by the hearth and set a smooth stone there, one she'd carried from the creek and washed clean. And when she looked at it, resting in the dustless space, she didn't know if it was an altar or a grave, only that it felt right, like laying something old to rest. The cowboy didn't ask what she was doing, didn't question when she rearranged the shelves or tucked herbs above the doorframe. And when she stepped outside one afternoon with a tin pail and returned with a lap full of wild roots, he didn't speak, just passed her the small knife he always kept beside the stove and let her work. They shared meals without comment now, 2 bowls, 2 spoons, always silence. But something in the quiet had changed, had softened like an old wound that no longer stung when pressed. She caught him once staring at the ridge beyond the cabin with his jaw tight and his brow low, and she knew then that he wasn't just a man who lived alone. He was a man who had lost something once, something big enough to hollow him out. And maybe that's why he'd never sent her away, never reached for her, never demanded anything, because he knew what it meant to carry broken things too long. That night, when the fire burned low and they both sat in its fading warmth, she unfolded the cloth she'd been working on. It was just a square, rough and crooked, stitched with uneven lines, but it was hers, the first thing she'd made with her own 2 hands since the day her father sold her for a bottle of gin and a losing hand of cards. She didn't offer it to him. She simply placed it on the table between them and waited, and when he picked it up, turned it once, and set it back down without a word, she felt more seen than if he'd spoken volumes. She began humming again, soft, tuneless things under her breath while she worked, while she walked the slope behind the cabin, while she washed clothes by the creek. And though the sound was no louder than a breeze through pine, it was hers, and she didn't try to silence it. One morning she watched a hawk circle above the canyon and land on a split branch not 10 feet away. Its eyes met hers, sharp and sure, and in that gaze she felt no fear, only recognition. She was no longer just the girl who had been traded. She was something else now, something unnamed but whole. And as she stood beneath the wide, waiting sky, with her feet in cold earth and her hands raw from work that no one saw but the land itself, she knew no matter where she had come from, no matter what had been taken, she had begun at last to return to herself. The creek ran thin through the dry gulch behind the cabin, water moving slow like memory, its banks cluttered with broken branches and smooth stones that shimmered beneath the weak light. And she crouched beside it with her skirt hiked to her knees, scrubbing fabric against the current, her fingers stiff but steady. Each garment she cleaned felt more hers than before, even if the stitches were uneven and the colors faded. And when she wrung the cloth out with practice care, she felt the ache in her arms like a badge rather than a burden. The cowboy had given her nothing, no title, no vow, not even a name, yet somehow everything she touched inside that house had become shaped by her hands, softened by her presence, like the cabin itself had leaned toward her without meaning to. The air had changed, not sweeter, not softer, just more alive, more lived in, as if her silence had been absorbed into the beams and floorboards and made the whole place breathe a little deeper. She'd found a cracked mirror in the trunk weeks ago and propped it behind the stove, not to admire herself, but to remember that she still had a face, that she wasn't invisible anymore. And though the reflection was warped and darkened by age, she'd sometimes catch her own eyes in it and pause, not in shame, not in sorrow, but in curiosity, as if asking the woman she'd become what she might do next. She learned the sound of the horse's hooves before he even appeared at the ridge, the pace and rhythm of his approach, the slight creak of leather before he dismounted. And each time he returned, she felt something ease in her shoulders, as if some part of her had waited, even when she didn't mean to. She still kept her words tucked deep, the way children hide stolen coins, but she'd begun to breathe louder, step firmer, hum longer, the kind of things no one could take from her. The garden she started behind the shed was barely more than a patch of dry soil and hope, but she turned it over with her hands, pulled weeds, planted roots. And when a single green sprout emerged, it filled her chest with something fierce and glowing, not pride, not joy, just proof that life still grew in broken places. The cowboy watched without interfering, his gaze always lingering a moment longer than it should have, then flicking away like it had betrayed him. And though he never commented on the garden, he began leaving tools where she could reach them, a small trowel by the step, a folded piece of burlap beside the door, a rusted tin cup filled with ash to mix into the soil. She noticed how his roughness never touched her, not in words, not in movement, and when his boots thudded heavy across the floor, it no longer made her tense. She began baking bread again, flat, hard rounds that smelled of salt and sweat. And though she never asked if he liked it, he always ate it all. On one quiet evening she found a bundle beside the hearth, wrapped in oilskin, tied with string. And when she unfolded it, she found cloth, thick wool dyed with dark red dye and fraying at the corners. It wasn't new, wasn't precious, but it was clean and warm, and the message in its presence was simple enough to understand. She mended it carefully, folded it tight, and when night fell and the fire hissed low, she draped it over her shoulders without looking at him. He didn't glance her way, didn't shift, but she saw the corner of his mouth twitch, not a smile, but something close, and that was enough. The quiet between them no longer felt like absence. It was a presence, deep and wide, filled with things that didn't need to be said. The stars outside blinked silver through the black branches, and she watched them through the open window, her hand resting lightly on the windowsill as if she could reach the past and push it further away. That night she dreamed of soil and water and firelight, of her own fingers shaping something lasting, and when she woke, there was a stillness in her bones she had never known before. She sat on the edge of the cot with her bare feet pressed to the floor, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she didn't brace herself for anything. Outside, the horse stamped once in the dirt, the wind nudged the corner of the roof, and the man who didn't want a wife rolled over in his sleep without waking, but the woman who had been sold now breathed as if she belonged. It started with a sound, faint, brittle, out of place. Not the steady rhythm of the cowboy's horse or the rustle of dry grass in the wind, but the sharp snap of a twig, the breath of hooves too light to carry weight, but too sure to be lost. And from the cabin window she saw a figure moving through the trees, not fast, not stealthy, just bold in the way men moved when they believed the world owed them something. The kind of man who carried danger in his posture, not his weapon because he was used to being feared long before he ever had to raise a hand. She froze, breath caught between memory and instinct, and in that terrible, stinging moment, she felt the girl she'd buried crawl back up her throat, the one who had knelt on saloon floors, the one who'd been traded like coin. And though her body had grown stronger, her steps more rooted, her soul still carried the bruise of being someone else's debt. The cowboy was still gone, out tracking game or checking fences, and the silence of the cabin offered no protection, only the memory of what had once been taken. The man reached the door without knocking, his boots dragging like he had all the right in the world, and when he stepped inside, the smell of old sweat and dried tobacco followed him like a shadow. She backed away slowly, hands trembling, not from fear of pain, but from the terrible knowing that no one could stop what was coming, not this time. And the stranger's eyes swept over the cabin like he'd been here before, like he was counting everything that might now belong to him. He didn't speak, didn't need to, and she could feel in his stillness the kind of cruelty that dressed itself in patience, that waited for women to break on their own. But she did not speak either. She only reached behind her, past the stove, where a rusted iron skillet hung from a nail, and as she closed her fingers around its handle, something ancient uncurled in her chest. Not rage, not courage, just survival. The man took one step closer, and then the door slammed open again, not with wind but with purpose, and the cowboy stood there, rifle raised, jaw locked, breath heavy, not loud, not shaking, just alive with a fury so deep it felt cold. The standoff was quiet, no shouts, no threats, just the slow spin of the stranger as he turned to face the man who'd bought a wife he never wanted and somehow ended up guarding her like she was made of more than bruises and bargains. The girl stood frozen, skillet in hand, heart pounding in the cage of her ribs like it wanted out, and the silence between the two men was thick with the weight of things unspoken. She watched the cowboy's eyes, dark and steady, trained not on the man's weapon but on his posture, his breath, the twitch of muscle in his jaw. And she realized then that this wasn't the first time he'd stood between danger and something fragile. The stranger didn't reach for his gun. He wasn't stupid. He just backed toward the door with that same slow swagger, like nothing inside had changed, like the story wasn't over. And as he stepped outside, his voice finally came, low and mean and full of the promise that this wasn't the end. The cowboy didn't follow, didn't shoot. He just lowered the rifle with slow precision and shut the door so gently it might have been a whisper. She dropped the skillet without realizing, her knees buckling beneath her. And when she slid down the wall to the floor, she didn't cry. She just sat there with her palms on the boards and her eyes locked on the space where the stranger had stood. He knelt beside her, not close, not touching, just close enough to be real. And for the first time since she'd been dragged into that saloon and sold for coins and shame, she looked at him not as the man who'd bought her, but as the one who had given her silence and time and enough space to remember her own shape. That night she didn't sleep, not from fear, but from the terrible lightness that came after fear had passed. And when the fire burned low and his shape blurred in the glow, she whispered a name under her breath, not his, not hers, just a name she chose for herself, one no one had ever used, one that made her feel clean. Outside, the trees shivered under the weight of the stranger's shadow, still fading from the ridge. But inside, the cabin held something stronger than locks or rifles. It held the memory of her not breaking, of standing, of choosing to stay. The morning after the stranger left the ridge, the air was dense and heavy, not with weather, not with fear, but with something settled, like the cabin had finally exhaled after holding its breath too long. And when she rose from the cot, her bare feet touched the floor with more weight than they ever had before. She moved with purpose now, not the kind that demanded to be seen, but the kind that carried itself like an invisible thread pulled tight between her spine and her will. She swept the ash from the hearth, sliced potatoes with practiced grace, and hung a strip of venison to dry beside the smoke hole, all while her mind replayed the standoff that had not ended in blood but had carved a new boundary into her bones. The cowboy spoke little still, but his movements had changed, not larger, not louder, just different, like he was careful now in a way that wasn't fear but reverence, the same way a man might walk around a tree struck by lightning and still standing. When he returned from his ride, he brought her a spool of thread and a bundle of cloth, blue, faded, soft, and he placed it on the table like an offering, not to be thanked for, just to be understood. She took it without ceremony, ran her hand across the fabric, and began cutting it into pieces that would one day become something else, maybe curtains, maybe a dress. She didn't know yet, but she knew the act of shaping was what mattered most. The soil behind the cabin had grown softer with the warming light, and she planted onions and root vegetables, her fingers digging deep into the earth. And with every seed she pressed into the ground, she whispered small things, not prayers, not names, just pieces of herself she was willing to let grow. The horse had begun to nudge her shoulder when she came near, its breath warm against her cheek. And she'd started brushing its mane without being asked, humming low as her fingers moved through the coarse hair, her song rising like dust in the stillness. Inside the cabin, she hung dried herbs from the beams, stitched padding into the old chair by the fire, and folded linens into shapes that calmed her, not because they were neat, but because they were hers. At night, she no longer curled herself small. She stretched, she breathed full, and when sleep came it didn't steal, it gave. She dreamed of places she'd never seen, of rivers wide and slow, of mountains that cradled valleys like a mother's arms. And when she woke, there was no shame, only the quiet thrill of having been somewhere beautiful and untouched. One afternoon, while mending a tear in the cowboy's coat, she found a patch sewn inside, rough, nearly invisible. And when she picked at the edge, it revealed a torn scrap of something older, something hidden. And though she didn't understand it, she sewed it back in place without question, her fingers pressing it flat like a secret best left unspoken. That evening, the cowboy sat across from her with his hat in his lap, his face lit by the flickering stove, and the silence between them held something that was no longer just absence, it was shelter. She felt herself drifting toward the edge of trust, not falling, not leaping, just leaning into it like a child might lean into a warm breeze. The past still whispered in shadows, in rusted hinges, in the sting of sudden noise, but it no longer dictated her steps. She had grown past it like a vine through a crack in stone, stubborn, unseen, but sure. Her body bore the history of survival, but her spirit was beginning to write something new. The next morning she found the cowboy outside before dawn, sharpening his knife beneath the low light, his breath rising in clouds. And without speaking, she handed him a bowl of bread and berries she'd prepared. He took it with a nod, sat beside her on the steps, and they ate without looking at each other, both staring into the sky as if it held answers to questions neither dared to ask. When he rose, he brushed a speck of dust from her shoulder, then turned and walked toward the corral, not a touch meant to claim, not even one meant to comfort, just a gesture of recognition, of acknowledgement, like two travelers passing in the same direction and realizing they no longer needed to walk alone. She watched him go with her hands folded in her lap, and for the first time she smiled, not for him, not for herself, but for the simple fact that she had lived long enough to feel like a person again. Behind her the cabin creaked, not in protest but in welcome. The sky opened that morning in a burst of light too clean to ignore. Golden beams slanted across the dry ridge and caught on the cabin window like a promise slipping past the cracks. And when she stepped outside, the cool earth pressed into her feet like it was greeting her, not just bearing her weight. She walked the edge of the corral with a piece of cloth tied around her head, her hands stained from the garden, her arms marked with the quiet labor of someone who had made herself useful, not for praise, not for payment, but because it made her feel real. The cowboy stood near the fence, tightening a rope, eyes squinting into the sun. And though he didn't look up when she passed, there was something in his stillness that had shifted, as if the land he once owned alone had now learned to breathe in two rhythms. She went to the stream and dipped a tin basin into the water, her reflection swirling in pieces as she filled it. And for a flickering second she saw not the girl who had once been dragged from her father's arms to pay off a debt, not the shadow that had lived in silence, but a woman made of ash and river, of soil and stitch, of fire and breath. The image vanished as ripples spread, but it stayed inside her, settled behind her ribs like a new kind of memory, waiting to be believed. When she returned to the cabin, she found a box left on the table, old wood carved at the corners, tied shut with a strip of faded red. And inside were trinkets, scattered things with no worth, buttons, thread, an old brush, a cracked pendant, a folded piece of parchment she dared not open. But beneath it all, a note scrawled on scrap paper in a rough square hand, only 3 words written in ink that looked like it had waited years to dry. She didn't read them aloud. She didn't need to. She folded the note back into the box, placed the lid carefully, and held it to her chest like it might hold something sacred. She didn't ask what it meant, didn't ask who gave it, because some things don't need answers, only acceptance. That night, the wind held low across the plains, not violent, not cold, but persistent, and she lay on the cot with the wool blanket drawn to her chin, staring at the beams above her while the fire cracked and hissed beside the stove. The cowboy sat in the corner with his hat slouched over his knee, his eyes distant as if watching something long gone but still pulsing through the room like a ghost. They didn't speak, hadn't for hours, but the silence between them had thickened into something almost solid, something that wrapped itself around the room like cotton batting, muffling every sharp edge. She sat up slowly, her hair spilling down her back, and looked across at him, not with question, not with fear, but with the gaze of someone who had finally stopped bracing for harm. He met her eyes. For once, he didn't look away. And something in his expression, tight around the mouth, soft in the eyes, bruised in the soul, made her heart do a strange, stumbling twist. She stood, walked toward him, not carefully, not boldly, just without hesitation. And when she reached his side, she didn't speak, didn't touch him, just stood there while the firelight painted both their shadows against the wooden wall. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small, a leather strap worn smooth by fingers and time, and without a word, he placed it in her hand. It wasn't jewelry, it wasn't a ring. It was a piece of his life, his history, his own broken thing, and by giving it to her, he'd carved out space in his silence for her to exist inside it. She took it, wrapped it once around her wrist, and turned back toward the cot, her breath calm, her steps slow, but something inside her had caught fire. That night she didn't dream of escape or storms or saloons or hands dragging her through dust. She dreamed of a house with windows wide open, of a woman planting seeds in the earth and laughing at nothing, of a man building a fence that didn't keep things out but kept things in. And in that dream, she wasn't owed. She wasn't owned. She wasn't forgotten. She was chosen, not because she was beautiful, not because she was obedient, but because she had become herself, and he had seen her. The wind had calmed by morning, not stilled but softened, as if the land itself had exhaled after carrying too many ghosts across its open back. And when she stepped out into the pale light, with her hands wrapped in cloth and her eyes already narrowed against the sun, she felt no ache, no hesitation, only a strange stillness in her chest that didn't feel empty anymore. The garden rose she'd planted now bore thin green shoots poking bravely through the soil, and she bent over them with care, her fingers tracing the lines she'd sown with more faith than knowledge, knowing now that even the broken can bloom if given. Room to root. She heard him before she saw him, the cowboy's horse making its steady, unhurried path down the slope, and when she looked up, he wasn't just returning to the cabin, he was returning to her. To the woman he'd once taken in with nothing but silence and soup and a roof not meant to hold another soul. He dismounted without speaking and tied the reins to the rail with one hand, the other holding a satchel filled with supplies, sugar, coffee, a new tin kettle, and when he walked past her into the cabin, he left the door open like an invitation. She followed him inside without wiping her boots, without folding into herself. She just stepped over the threshold as if it belonged to her now, and maybe it did, not by ownership, but by presence. The cabin looked different to her now, not larger, not warmer, but familiar in a way nothing else had ever been. And as he set the satchel on the table and began unwrapping its contents, she noticed he had also brought back fabric, soft muslin, pale yellow, the kind that could become a dress or a cradle blanket or curtains that caught morning light. She didn't ask why, she didn't need to. She touched it with the same care she used to touch the earth. And when he reached into his coat one last time and placed something else beside it, a small tin box filled with seeds, she felt her throat close with a swell of something too deep to name, not affection, not gratitude, something older, something earned. Later that night, when the fire had burned down and they sat in the hush that only people who had survived sorrow together could share, she stood from the cot and crossed the room, her step steady, her face calm. He was seated near the door, sharpening a blade with his usual focus, and he looked up when she stopped in front of him, not startled, not curious, just waiting. And when she reached into her apron and pulled out the folded piece of muslin she'd been sewing, she handed it to him like it was the only truth she had left. He unfolded it slowly, and there in the center, stitched with unsteady but certain hands, was her name. Not the one her father had given her, not the one barked by gamblers and ranch hands and saloons, a name of her own choosing, a name that had never been spoken aloud. She waited as he read it with his eyes, then folded it again, placed it gently on the table beside him, and looked up with something in his gaze that finally mirrored what she had begun to believe, that she wasn't a weight he had carried. She was the only reason he hadn't crumbled. That night, she lay beneath the wool blanket with her back to the wall and her face to the window, and when he extinguished the lantern and crossed the room, he paused at the edge of the cot just long enough to let the moment settle. Then he lay down on the floor beside her, not touching, not speaking, just there in the dark. She reached her hand down and let her fingers brush his. He didn't pull away, and that was all. She didn't need a ceremony or a promise. She had something truer now, a shared silence no one else could understand. Morning came with light that spilled across the floor like mercy, and when she rose, he was already gone. Outside, his coat draped over the fence post, his hat resting on the rail. She stepped onto the porch with her hands on her belly, flat but waiting, her breath held just a moment longer than usual. Behind her the cabin stood, not as a place of rescue, but as a place of return. In the still air, the truth pulsed quietly in her chest. She had not been saved. She had not been spared. She had been seen. And in the wide, aching hush of the land, that was enough.